right, why don't we go ahead and get started, everyone? So my name is Emily Silence. I work at Potomac Riverkeeper Network here. Today we're going to be discussing our Water Wednesday, which is microplastics and trash in the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay. So we have with us our Potomac Riverkeeper, Dean Naujoks. He's kind of going to be talking about what we've been doing to combat trash in the Potomac River, specifically what we're calling our Trash-Free Potomac campaign. And we have Jessie Meiller, who is a professor at American University and a microplastics researcher. She's going to be talking about kind of her research in microplastics in the Chesapeake Bay region. So a little housekeeping, wherever I do have everyone muted for now, since we do have possibly a big crew joining us. Feel free to type your questions in the chat. We have some time reserved at the end for any questions for both Dean or Jessie. So just a little bit about Potomac Riverkeeper Network before we get started. So we're a Riverkeeper network. Like I said, we use enforcement, advocacy, and assessments to utilize to do our work essentially. So we're out there on the river actually looking for pollution, looking for issues along the river. That's what our river keepers do. They're out there on their boats. They use drones, they use planes, all kinds of things to find pollution in our watershed. And we actually, kind of what sets us apart from other organizations is that we go after polluters. So an exciting thing is that we actually are able to, use legal action to force polluters to either clean up their messes, stop polluting, and so on and so forth. So we like to use that tool if necessary. But I think it's a great thing about our work because, we go as far as we possibly can to clean up the rivers, right? So I will go ahead and let Jessie get started. Like I said, she's going to talk about microplastics in the Bay. So Jessie, if you'd like to.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. I appreciate it. So I'm just going to get my slides up here, which takes a second, but I'd like to say thanks to everyone for inviting me and for Dean for spearheading this and working. I've been working with Dean. I'm going to talk a little bit about that on some of the things that I'm doing in microplastics on the Potomac too, but I'll give you a little bit more of a background of where it's coming from. Sorry, I have to reshare here. There we go. Emily, slides okay? Great, thanks. All right, so gotta move that up there. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about microplastics in the Chesapeake Bay, and I figured I would start at the beginning with plastic first, and this is probably a review for some of you, but I might as well start with what I'm going to be talking about and where it comes from. And most of the time when we're talking about commercial plastics, we're talking about polymers. They are usually made from oil-based raw materials that tend to start out as small molecules called monomers that then go through a process called polymerization that combines them to form larger molecules called polymers. And the reason this is important is because these polymers, when they make up plastic, they actually, they take a long time to break down too. All plastics are polymers, but not all polymers are plastics. Cellulose is an example of that. And so up until recently, almost all plastics were made from oil, but now a lot of them are actually made from ethane, which is a byproduct of the fracking process for natural gas, hydraulic fracturing. And so it's just something to keep in mind because there is a very close tie between plastics and fossil fuel industry and climate change as well. So something to keep in mind. And when we start thinking about where plastics come from and how long they've been in the environment, I always like to go back to thinking about the tie to human use of plastics and the plastics industry. There's really, plastics been produced for a long time, but really in the grand scheme of things, not that long, right? So a number of decades, but what's happened is that, there's there's no real end product for plastics. And the reality is that there used to be kind of a market for recycling plastic, but China has stopped taking our plastic in 2018. And so where it ends up now, usually it is either ends up in landfills or it gets incinerated. In the US, a lot more gets incinerated than recycled. And so, which is not good either, because when we burn the plastics, it releases all sorts of toxic chemicals into the air. And so that's not a good solution either. If you look at the red line on this graph, you can see a little star down there, and I won't make you guess what that is, but the year was 1967 then, and that's when the movie The Graduate was made, and when Dustin Hoffman's character Ben was advised with just one word: plastics. And so in 1967, less than 25 million tons of plastic were produced each year, but today it's over 300 million tons of plastic a year. And so, also the movement towards single-use plastic results that most of the plastic actually ends up in the trash, not necessarily in a lot of it can't even be recycled. So not just that there isn't a need for it, but it actually, it has to end up in the trash, it can't be recycled. So I became interested in plastics from a toxicology perspective. I am an environmental toxicologist, and because a lot of the additives that get used in plastics can be toxic, I became interested because they can have endocrine disrupting effects. They can have, so they can affect hormone systems. They can have reproductive toxicity, and some neurological and some cancer outcomes as well. And so that's how I started to become interested in plastics. And I've done most of my work on the Chesapeake Bay. So I was interested in seeing how plastics actually ended up in the water, where they were coming from. The reason I put this slide up here is that in 2010, there was a study that was done that was really comprehensive, looked at over 190 countries worldwide, with coastlines on the Atlantic, the Pacific, and Indian Oceans, as well as the Mediterranean and Black Seas. And it was looking at where plastic came from, and what they found, this study was published in 2015 in the journal Science, was that most of the plastic was originating on land, not in the oceans. And so a lot of it had to do with mismanagement of waste. So if we know that a lot of it is coming from land, how does it get from the land and then into the water? And that's why I started looking at plastics and the movement through tributaries specifically. And so I've done work on the Patapsco and the Anacostia and the Potomac mostly. And I'll talk a little bit about microplastics now. So what are microplastics? This slide, I think, is a pretty good summary of it. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration describes microplastics as being defined as any pieces that are smaller than 5 millimeters in size, and with a lower boundary of that actually leads up to them being classified as nanoplastics. But I'm just going to say everything smaller right now is microplastics, but there are different sizes below that as well. And so they usually get classified as either being primary microplastic or secondary microplastic. And primary microplastics are actually manufactured with the size range for industrial purposes. Like they can be used for they can actually be manufactured into little pellets or nurdles, you can see on the right up here, that then get used to in manufacturing processes for other types of plastics. So and so that's considered a primary plastic or primary microplastics. Other ones might be microbeads that can be used in abrasive industrial and commercial uses. Used to be used in like face washes and toothpaste and things. A lot of those things were phased out, but microbeads are still used in different commercial products also. And so then the other type of plastic are secondary microplastics, and those tend to be plastics that actually started out as macroplastics, bigger things that then get broken up into smaller and smaller pieces, usually in the environment. And I'll talk about those processes that cause that to happen in a couple minutes. But these secondary microplastics they're coming from larger plastics that are breaking up, and usually we have fragments and pieces of things. I'll show a couple pictures here. At the top here, you can see some fibers. Most of those are coming from textiles. Some fragments in the middle there, most of those are coming from larger pieces of plastic. And then on the bottom there, you see some pictures of microbeads. So I said I was going to talk a little bit about how microplastics form, especially the secondary microplastics. And we know that they're entering waterways from land. They're running off the land during rain events, down storm drains, into creeks and streams, and then, flowing through our watershed. So then what happens to them once they enter the waterways is, this slide actually shows some physical, chemical, and biological processes that can act on the plastics. Sun and UV radiation can cause photodegradation of plastics, breaking it up into smaller and smaller pieces over time. Chemicals that are already in the waterways can react with plastics, either by causing it to break up into smaller pieces, or the chemicals can possibly hitch a ride on the plastics and be carried downstream. And then the biological processes that interact with plastics could include microorganisms growing on their surfaces and being transported as well, or other organisms actually mistaking plastics for food and ingesting them. So why microplastics are a problem? The biggest reason is that they're ubiquitous, and they've been found in so many different environments around the world, on the tops of mountaintops that are extremely pristine in Antarctica, and actually in the air. We know that they're being transported in the air as well. So the other thing is that microplastics can contain mixtures of harmful chemicals, such as persistent organic pollutants, potentially pathogens. And then when they are digested by organisms, by animals in the waterways or on land, they can cause harm to those organisms, and they can also be incorporated into their habitats. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple slides. They can also be, when they are consumed by organisms, they can be passed up the food chain, so they can actually biomagnify and be carried up to the top predators at the top of the food chain, potentially carrying along some of those hazardous chemicals with them too. So I was going to talk about 3 different areas that I've worked on in the waterways. The first one actually started out as some projects with undergraduates, where we were in one of our labs. We were taking undergraduates out into local waterways, and we were collecting samples in the water, in the sediment, in the soil, looking for microplastics. That since has developed into a much bigger research project, but it started out working with students in the classes, which is great. The second project I'm going to talk about, I was working with some brown bullheads on the Anacostia and the Potomac rivers. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is about biofilms and biodiversity and how that relates to microplastics. So the first one, these are just some of the sites that we were looking at along the Anacostia and the Potomac. We actually were working in Rock Creek Park at the time too. And we would take students out, we would sample different sites through along the waterways and collect, like I said, water, sediment, and soil samples. And the students would do research projects on them in their classes. And so this was a class-based research project that started like that. A lot of the methods that we were using were actually developed from some of the NOAA methods that were looking at microplastics. And so the students were doing things like comparative studies of, between the Anacostia and the Potomac, or they were looking at different sections in different waterways and comparing them upstream, downstream, those kinds of things. But like I said, this was something that we started doing with the classes that actually yielded a lot of really interesting data and resulted in us actually developing research studies that we're still doing the analyses on, and hopefully we'll have something coming out soon on that. These are just some pictures of my students collecting their samples in these were actually all taken in, well, the middle one was in Rock Creek, but the one on the right and the left was on Nash Run on the Anacostia. And then this is just looking at some of the methods that we use in the lab. the sediment, we use the sieves to actually separate the different sizes of sediment and then get down to the small sizes looking for microplastics. And we use water filtration and to actually look for in the water samples, to filter the water samples to look for microplastics, and then microscopy to be able to do the counts and the concentrations. So one of the research projects that actually came out of that I have separate from the classes, but an actual research project that's more extensive and multi-years. We have some preliminary data that looking at some of the sites along a tributary to the Anacostia called Nash Run. And the reason we were interested in this tributary was because there are 2 trash traps along the waterway. And we were interested to see whether or not there were going to be differences in the microplastics that we saw upstream and downstream of the trash traps. And it doesn't seem like that's the case. We're now looking into rain events to see if there's actually any changes in the rain events for some of our sampling days that we went out. But what is of note that I want to point out, and why that graphic on the bottom right is there, is because almost everything that we see in the water are microfibers. Occasionally we see some fragments as well, but mostly when you're looking at water samples, you have things that are going to be either buoyant or at least neutrally buoyant. And so things that are actually floating or able to move in the water, less dense things, right? The more dense things are going to settle out and be in the sediment on the bottom. And so a lot of microfibers, all different sizes and all different colors. And so that's actually how we're looking at them right now. We're starting to think about whether or not there's anything to that and how that might be tied to sources. Again, this is just preliminary data. But we had some students that were working on that it could be really interesting to see what comes out of that. The second project that I wanted to mention was looking at brown bullheads. I was lucky to actually be able to tag along and work with the Fish and Wildlife Service that were already collecting brown bullheads. They have a really long-term, over 20-year project that they've been looking at brown bullheads on PCBs in their livers and on their mouths for tumors. And so they weren't interested in their digestive tracts. So I said, oh, can I tag along and take their digestive tracts? So I actually ended up getting to work in the lab there and dissected a lot of brown bullheads, and then looked for microplastics in their gastrointestinal tracts, which we found. Which is interesting because brown bullheads are bottom feeders. They're really benthic. They're eating things off of the bottom, I should say. And so it's interesting that we were seeing some of the more dense plastics in those samples. And then the third project that I am still working on is where I'm looking at biofilms and biodiversity and the microplastics that are actually found in those communities. I've been working with Maryland Sea Grant on this project. We started working in the Patapsco River. They had a long-term project that they were working on with discs that they would put out in the water and monitor them for biofilms and do biodiversity indices on them. Well, I was really curious whether or not there were actually microplastics, assuming that there were probably microplastics in it. So we started this project probably about 4 or 5 years ago and have been working with high school students in Baltimore City, Baltimore County, Carroll County, and most recently we're working in DC as well now. And we're spreading this project to actually be to start work in National Harbor, which we began after partnering with the Potomac Riverkeeper network. So I'll talk about that in a minute too. But these are just some pictures here where you can see some of the organisms that we see on the biofilm discs. And you can see some hydroids. There's an amphipod in the bottom left there, a little mud crab, and some Melisira as well. And then you can also see some plastics and some microfibers. So these are on aluminum discs that we put out on racks and we leave out for months, but we check them every couple of weeks to see using microscopes to see what is growing on the discs of the organisms that are living there and whether or not there are microplastics that are being either taken in by the organisms or actually incorporated into their habitats. And actually, if you see the top right photo there, it just looks like a pile of mud, but it's actually not. Those are burrows for mudworms, and we have seen microfibers that actually have been kind of woven in and integrated into their burrows. And so the work that we were doing there led to some pretty interesting partnerships with teachers, like I mentioned, around Maryland and now hopefully in DC as well. And this was a recent teacher workshop that we did up in Carroll County, Maryland. But using discs both from the Patapsco in the Baltimore Harbor and also from National Harbor. And you can see in the middle top photo there, those are some of the racks that we actually took to work on with the teachers in the workshop. And we found some really interesting organisms from the National Harbor, including this sponge that you can kind of see in the bottom left photo on the discs. It's kind of like the whitish material that's underneath some of the algae. So why this matters, microplastics can have a number of ecological effects, and some of the things that we think about actually maybe not showing up right away, but things down the road, like these perhaps population level or community level effects, some of the impaired reproduction problems, or when you have hormone disruption. And then some of the other environmental effects that can result. We do know that over 200 different diverse species actually have been shown to ingest microplastics. So if we know that they're taking them in, it's what are they doing to the organisms? And at a macro scale, we know that plastics can block digestive tracts. It can reduce the urge to eat, and it can alter feeding behavior, which can then result in reduced growth and reproduction. So an example of that is is fish that were exposed to polyethylene had liver damage, and oysters that were exposed to polystyrene, which is styrofoam, had decreased reproductive success with fewer eggs and sperm. And so we know that if organisms are taking in these types of plastics and they're staying in their systems, that they can actually have longer term effects because of it, and adverse effects. We also know that because microplastics can be passed through the food chain, that the organisms at the top of the food chain can actually have some of the most detrimental effects because they can build up higher levels of them. Also, I mentioned before that plastics can actually carry or carry along different kinds of other kinds of contaminants, including PAHs and flame retardants and some pesticides that can actually kind of hitch a ride on the microplastics. And then they can move up the food chain as well. All right. And then I just wanted to, people always ask about exposures to humans too. And what we do know is that humans are taking in microplastics, both through inhalation and ingestion. And we do know that they are moving through our systems. We're still doing a lot of research, not me per se, but other people are doing research on the different types of effects that humans might experience. And I'll talk about some of those in a second. The different kinds of exposures that have been looked at have included different kinds of foods that we eat, but also things that we know might be taking up plastics, like sea salt, right? We know that microplastics are occurring in marine environments. So therefore, are they building up in the salt that we're actually extracting from the water and using to then on our food, right? So microplastics have been found in sea salt. They've also been found in water and in beer and in lots of different kinds of organisms that we consume from oceans and from waterways, including mussels and clams and shrimp, and even higher up on the food chain too, like anchovies and sardines and different kinds of fish, up to Atlantic cod and carp and things. And so some of the adverse human health effects that might be caused by exposure to plastic particles might be due to things like the additives that are used in plastics, or maybe perhaps to the chemicals that might be hitching a ride, like I mentioned with some of the environmental effects. And then, one of the things that people say, well, there are microplastics everywhere. Well, actually, some of the highest levels that they've found have been in bottled water, not in tap water, although it has been found in tap water as well. But there was a study that came out in 2018, and it looked at the at microplastics that were found in different kinds of bottled water. And so it was pretty extensive and looked at a number of different brands, and microplastics, I think, were found in all of them, or maybe it was all but one. And so some of the potential effects that we might see, like I mentioned, it might be due to the additives like phthalates or bisphenol A, which you might have heard of some of those, or perhaps flame retardants. But some of those that might actually result in human health effects include we know that phthalates can actually, phthalates are used to make softer, like more flexible plastics. And it's an additive that's commonly used. And we do know that phthalates have been shown to cause male reproductive abnormalities in rats. And I mentioned bisphenol A, which actually has been linked to cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and liver enzyme changes, also some reproductive effects as well. But a lot more research needs to happen, especially when we're thinking about exposures to mixtures of different chemicals, maybe different kinds of plastics. But I wanted to mention now because I have to turn over to Dean in a second. So I'll just mention some of the partnerships that we've formed as a result of this work. I love working in and around like locally, because then I get to partner with local organizations. So Potomac Riverkeeper Network is one of them, and we've been lucky to be working near their boat in the National Harbor, and they've connected us to the marina there, who's been very, very nice in letting us put some discs out there and some racks so that we can do some of our biofilm biodiversity work, and we're able to use the boat also, and we have provided a microscope for the boat so that we're able to work together on this work right there in the harbor, which is so cool to be able to do this. We're finding some really interesting things. And I've also been working with a couple of other organizations, including Recycle Leaders. They have been doing an outreach and an education program in Maryland, Virginia, and DC high schools that's focused on microfibers and reducing the amount of microfibers that people are, or I guess taking accountability for them and trying to reduce the shedding of microfibers. And I also work with the Clean Headwaters program with One Montgomery Green, which is a nonprofit in Montgomery County, Maryland. And I've been working with them on some education projects for a number of years now on microplastics, where they have students, mostly high school students, but also some middle school students in and around Montgomery County that are actually collecting samples and doing the research, and on their local waterways, usually very close to where their high schools are. So it's been a lot of fun doing some of those programs with them. So I'll end there and just say that, some of the last, I guess the takeaways are that, there's still a lot more research that needs to be done. And the areas that I'm currently pursuing include trying to identify some of the plastics that we have been able to isolate from water and sediment and the biofilms around the waterways, and then also looking at these interface between the biological, chemical, and physical components of the microplastics in the waterways, and then continuing to expand the education and outreach initiatives like this. So I'm excited to be here, and thank you again for asking me to participate.
Thanks, Jesse.
Great, yeah, thanks, Jesse. I like moderating our Water Wednesdays because I always learn something new each time. It's fun. Okay, great. So let's turn it over to Dean Naujoks, our Potomac Riverkeeper, who's going to talk to you a little bit about, how we keep trash out of our waterways and what kind of Potomac Riverkeeper Network is doing to keep the Potomac trash free.
Thanks. Can you see my slide?
No.
Here we go. Sorry about that, y'all. So anyway, can you see it now?
Still no.
Okay. I don't know what to do. I'm sitting here looking at it, trying to share it. Anyway, my name is Dean Naujoks. I'm your Potomac Riverkeeper. I greatly appreciate. So what do I need to do, Emily, to get this up? I don't understand.
Did you do share screen? I can
Yeah,
see a really big version of your face. Maybe what happens if I remove your spotlight? It was working earlier. Oh, here we go. Now it's working. You cut.
Apologize, y'all. Yeah, I can't get to from the beginning. It's this.
If you go to
Blocking my
present, yeah. Yeah, there you go.
Here we go. Sorry, y'all. So anyway, I'm really glad Jessie got to go first because I think she does a great job of highlighting what a serious issue this is. I am by no means an expert on this issue. I'm just starting to learn a lot about this issue, and what I've learned obviously concerns me, which is why we're doing this. If you're not familiar with Potomac Riverkeeper Network, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do as an organization. Sorry, Frank and Lisa, I'm sure you've heard this before, but our job is to protect the public's right to clean water. And as Emily mentioned, we stop pollution, and we're really focused on providing public benefit and enjoyment for our waterways. And one of the things that we do is we protect and defend the river. So we do our own patrols, we conduct our own permit reviews, identify, do our own investigations. We use drones, aerial flyovers, sampling to investigate sources of pollution impact. We usually work to enforce Clean Water Act compliance to eliminate those sources of pollution. And more recently, one of the things that we've been doing is just building programs to engage people in building community around clean water. And that's been a big part. And so, investigating source of pollution, like eliminating toxic metals from the Morgantown coal plant, engaging people in public hearings and really important clean water issues, and working with communities that are dealing with important clean water issues. Sometimes we do use legislation when enforcement doesn't work. This was not recently, after 5 years, finally got Dominion to agree to dumping 27.5 million gallons of untreated toxic coal ash water into the Potomac River back in 2015. It led to a 1.4 million settlement. But legislatively, we also got Dominion to clean up 28 million tons of toxic coal ash in the state of Virginia. And that was a major campaign on our part, and involved a lot of partners doing that. We had success in forcing Alexandria in 2017 to fix their combined sewer system. We've been dealing a lot in the courts with DC's combined sewer systems. And, these are major sources of trash and plastic pollution, as well as sewage. So building these tunnels, capturing all this sewage as well as trash, helps keep a lot of plastic and trash out of our waterways. We have our community science volunteer water quality monitoring program. This is just another pathway. We have our floating laboratory down at National Harbor. We have dozens of volunteers. We're publicly posting the results so that people know when it's safe to go swimming in the river and when it's not. Post this every single week on Fridays going into the weekend, so people know when it's safe for human contact, when it's not. We're just starting a rapid response team using our Tier 3 certified lab to go out and, instead of just reporting about what the river conditions are, actually finding sources of pollution and working to keep those out of the river. We have River Palooza, ways to get people on the water, connect people to the resource that we're trying to protect. And this has all been evolving as an organization over the past 5 years or so. I've been here 6 years. I've been a riverkeeper for 20 years. And I just have to tell you, bottom line is, I can't ignore this issue anymore. When I go down to my boat, this is at the marina in James Creek in DC. This is what it looks like after a rain event. And, anybody who has a boat, anybody who's been on the river knows that trash and plastics are a serious problem. Oxen Cove, which is right on the border in DC, half of it's in Maryland. We just over the winter, we had 5 days of cleanup with 131 volunteers, we pulled 270 bags of trash, 20,000 plastic bottles. I mean, it was unbelievable. 1,600 bottle caps. I mean, this list goes on and on. It was astounding. Everybody who came was literally blown away by how much trash and plastic. So we have all these like great pictures, obviously, of people getting involved. It was a great effort what they did, but we could be out there every single day cleaning up, and it won't make a difference in this issue. And so we do think it's important to continue to engage people and building community around clean water. So in 2019, we had less than 50 volunteers. By 2020, we had over 250. This year alone, we've had over more than 500 volunteers. And a lot of that has to do with our trash cleanups. Our water quality monitoring, we have got a lot of great volunteers, but really we're seeing a lot of interest in our trash. So we have monthly trash cleanups in Alexandria, actually 2, one at Belhaven Marina, and then one at and then we also have them at National Harbor. And so, we're, as Jesse mentioned, building community, working with them on microplastics. We have our lab over there. We're doing cleanups. This is my daughter getting embarrassed by me, teenagers. But I do think it's important for everybody to understand that every time it rains, trash, brake dust, oil, grease, fertilizers, pet waste, all flow down these storm drains into the Potomac River. And every time I do these cleanups, and I've been doing them for 20 years now, people are always saying, God, I can't believe people are dumping all this trash in the river. And I think it's really, really important that people understand that this is not just people throwing bags of trash in the river. This is washing off parking lots at Starbucks and dumpsters that are located right next to storm drains, like I see right here where I live in Fairfax County. And just all this trash every time it rains is just literally entering the Potomac River through these storm drains into a small tributary. I think Jesse touched on this a little bit, but I was I guess when I first started learning about this issue, it was more in my mind, more of an issue that was linked to ocean issues and ocean plastics, and not something as a riverkeeper maybe I could deal with, or what was directly connected to the work I do. But this report, this came out, these 50 research management policy experts, Jesse was one of them, met at George Mason back in 2019, and their conclusions were that basically that the microplastic pollution in the bay and the watershed is an urgent issue and may affect restoration success and warrants immediate action by the Chesapeake Bay Partnership. And so I think it's important what they determine is that this is not just some faraway issue. This is happening right here. And if you see in their report, the stack, they basically say that the Chesapeake Bay Watershed contains numerous urban and suburban areas that via storm drains are sources of plastic waste to the Potomac River and Bay ecosystems. And you can just see, like in Oxen Cove, I mean, we're getting inundated, and there's just all these wetlands. Every wetland that is connected to a water body is becoming these trapping zones for plastics that are then breaking down and getting in. Jesse highlighted all the systems, all the aquatic life that's being impacted by this. So I think, on a bigger picture, I think it's important. Jesse mentioned that 2018, China said that they were no longer going to take waste, right? Our recycling. That went into effect in 2020. So I don't think even most lawmakers are really acknowledging that we are in a serious landfill and recycling crisis in the US. Like right here in Fairfax County, we're not taking glass anymore. Our recycling programs are basically falling apart at this point. Plastic bottle and food industry they don't want to fix this problem. They've had 30 years. I worked on a lot of this recycling legislation in the early 90s. I'm kind of appalled, honestly, at how little we've done to advance recycling. Only 9% of single-use plastics are being recycled. 12% are being burned. That's going to increase now that we're running out of landfill space. China's not taking this. As Jesse mentioned, there's direct ties to the oil and gas industry. So this is a climate change issue. And then on top of that, we have weak legislation, weak lawmakers. The chemical conversion bill that passed last year in Virginia, Philip Massigas, our legal director, vice president, worked exhaustingly on this issue, trying to tell Democrats, who can consider themselves environmentalists like Ken Plum, that this was not the road to go down. Like, we should not be doing this. And they passed it at the request of the industry, the plastic bottling industry and everything. We just passed a plastic bag fee in Fairfax County that was passed in the General Assembly almost 2 years ago, and like, this is supposed to be some big victory when a lot of other states like New Jersey and Maine are banning plastic bags. We're just finally getting a bag fee. So there's, I don't know what Jesse, I want to get Jesse's opinion on this, but to me, one of the things that I see as promising is this Oregon legislation in Maine that basically, implemented these bills for extended producer responsibility, basically making the bottle and brand owners and the packaging industry and the food service industry help pay for recycling, and then also upgrade the recycling programs in those states. In Maine, it's a full pay. They pay for everything. In Oregon, it's a quarter. But the bottom line is, I see there are some promising solutions, because if we're just going to leave it on lawmakers and municipalities, they're just not going to have the resources, and we're going to just be sending more of this waste into our landfills and not recycling at all. So we created this Trash-Free Potomac campaign just basically because we felt it was such an important issue. We're just getting started on it, but one of the goals is to create this Nova Plastics Coalition with a lot of groups. I think there's an opportunity in Virginia. There's this plastic waste advisory council that was started, passed by the General Assembly of Virginia, and they're supposed to make recommendations on a range of plastic related issues, focus on eliminating plastic waste. But this committee, this is basically stacked with all plastic, bottle manufacturing, the industry. There's Jen Cole, who's the lone environmentalist, and one, somebody from the academia. And other than that, I just don't see them actually doing anything meaningful. So it's going to take the public to really demand things like extended producer responsibility laws, I think, to put pressure on Ken Plum, who's leading that committee, to let the public needs to let lawmakers know that this is an important issue. And we're just not there yet. And so one of the things that we're trying to work on is expanding our partnerships and start working on this issue in DC. And Maryland, now we're talking to Trash Free Maryland about building coalition around this issue. And so I think, as an organization, we are trying to expand our influence to take these issues on and have more impact. But we're also trying to work with other partners. So if this issue is important to you, if you care about clean water, and you care about the Potomac River, please join us. If you're not a member, please become a member of our organization. If you'd like to get involved with like this Plastics Coalition in Virginia or other ways, send an email to Serena, or she's our outreach coordinator, serena@prknnetwork.org. You can come out to our next river cleanup on September 25th. You just email volunteer@prknnetwork.org, or you can go to our website. I think, most importantly, I just hope people here start refusing plastics. I mean, I've had to make lifestyle changes, and it's not been easy. But one thing I've definitely started doing is I will not take a plastic bag out of a store anymore. I will not buy a plastic bottle. I will not do that. I think, most people, can you just seriously wait till you actually get home to fill your water bottle with ice and water? Or do you absolutely need that bottle of water at the convenience store when you're 5 minutes from your home, right? So reduce, reuse, recycle is no longer good enough. We must start refusing plastics and then start demanding change on this issue. And it needs to come from the public, because I don't think our lawmakers fully comprehend this issue. And I don't think, with the influence the plastic industry and the plastic bottle industry has, and food manufacturers, we have a really tough road to hoe, but I'm inspired to see what like Maine is doing in other states. So that's my hope. That's where we want to start heading. If you need to get a hold of me for any reason, that's my email, dean@potomacriverkeeper.org. And then obviously we'd like to open it up to discussion. So thank you all for coming. I appreciate your interest in this issue.
All right, awesome. All right, I was gonna. Okay, great. So I'm going to read out some of the questions that we got for you, Dean and Jesse, to answer. We definitely have a few in the chat. See how many we can get through. Can always drop more. All right, so I scroll up to the beginning here. Okay. Okay, so the first question, so what are you doing about all the trash that gets left upriver just below Chain Bridge where people fish, cook, etc., and leave so much trash there? It just washes on into the river there.
We did a cleanup there back in 2015, but to be perfectly blunt, there were other groups that felt like that was their area for river cleanup. So we've not been back since. We have other locations that we do river cleanups, but I do know exactly where you're talking about, and we have in the past cleaned that area up.
Yeah, and then another question for you, Dean. In the intro, you mentioned supporting your work through legal action against companies. Do you ever consider legal action against local government entities and their contractors?
Yeah, I mean, if there's a hook, we definitely want to consider it. I mean, we're going to do everything we can. I mean, skipped over, I apologize, that one slide that really showed like trash traps, right? I mean, in DC, there is a trash TMDL, which is a legally binding requirement for DC to reduce and eliminate plastic and trash that's coming in via, storm drains, and they have trash traps. There's a different variety, but these are super expensive, $20,000 to up to $500,000 to install these things. And then there's maintenance issues. And so there, I guess my point is there's no easy fix, and it's not an easy angle in terms of a legal hook going after trash and plastic pollution. There's only 3 trash TMDLs in the whole country that I'm aware of, which is, right here, DC, LA, and up on the Baltimore Harbor. And I think most groups that have worked on those will tell you that they're not adequate. They're not doing enough, but it's a step in the right direction. Would I love to see more trash traps all through Virginia, Montgomery County? But I would love to. I would love to see municipal, but can we make that happen legally? I'm not really sure. But I think legislatively might be the best approach to dealing with plastics. In my opinion, I'd like to hear Jesse's opinion on that and EPR.
And I think that the trash TMDL is a place to start. Is that what you mean, Dean? Yeah, it's a place to start. In DC, it's made a difference, but it hasn't stopped the flow of it. The things that have stopped a lot of the trash, just based on the monitoring that they're seeing, are the bans. I mean, the bans on, I put that in the chat also, because you do see a huge decrease in the number of plastic bags when the plastic bag bans go into effect, or the styrofoam clamshells, or the straws. When those go into effect, then you see a drop in the trash.
Great, yeah. And for folks who are a little less wonky, TMDL stands for total maximum daily load, which is kind of how much of a thing can a body of water handle that's still safe for whatever. Okay, awesome. So next question, is releasing wax worms into the environment potentially part of the solution? Apparently they eat plastic. I don't know if either of you.
Question for Jesse.
Releasing things into the environment that we don't know what their effects are going to be is never a good idea until it's vetted extremely well first. But and waxworms, not sure that they would actually survive in the water, because I think that they live in wax. So I'm not positive. I'm not an expert on waxworms, but it's really cool though what they found that they can actually eat. I think it's just polyethylene, but so one type of plastic, maybe they eat other types of plastic too, but they've been found to metabolize them. I don't know a whole lot about them though, and what the effects are on them either. So I can't really speak to that as an expert. Good question though.
I will say the bottom line is no, we must prevent trash and pollution from entering our waterways. That is the answer, because, I mean, it's just like the trash wheel in the Baltimore Harbor. People are like, oh, that's great, it's out there cleaning up trash, but it's doing nothing to prevent trash and these major serious problems, this crisis that we're trying to emphasize. All this trash that's coming in every single storm drain into our waterways. we must start addressing that. And, you know, part of this is going to be local municipalities, like I said, with trash traps and other ways. But it really, we must look at the bigger picture and figure out ways like Maine's do and say, look, you're going to start paying for this. And, you know, it's going to lead to incentives to curb single-use plastics and the use of them just by doing that alone. And then obviously incentivizing and funding recycling programs. So that's my answer, at least.
Can I chime in again on that? Because I think, the Oregon and the Maine legislation is great. I'll give a big, but it still is relying on recycling. So instead of actually shifting the onus to the production and the manufacturing and the stopping of the flow of it, it's saying, okay, no, you have to pay for recycling, instead of making them do take back programs or actually stopping the production of it to begin with. So I think I think they're really, because what it does is it actually raises awareness and it does put the responsibility on them. So that's a huge start, but it's not actually stopping the flow. It's saying, okay, no, we're still going to recycle them. And the reality is that so much of the plastic, there's not a market for most types of recycled plastic. So while they might go into a recycling center, there's not a whole lot that's going to come out of it that's useful.
Dean, you're on mute.
That's why I wanted your thoughts on EPR, Jesse. So thank you.
Okay, awesome. So next question, what's the best thing that we as individuals can do to get more people on board with ending this issue?
Do you want to go first, Jesse?
This is the start. We talk about it and we try to raise awareness and we try to get more people to understand that the problem isn't necessarily recycling, but it is something more than that. And that there are actual effects, not just on fish, because people think, okay, well, the fish are eating it, so I just won't eat fish. Well, that's actually, they're indicators of what's going on out there, and it's actually happening in us too. And so I think that we should be aware of the fact that, at least from my perspective, with microplastics, macroplastics, we don't tend to take in as much, hopefully, but the microplastics, there's really no way around it. And so we should care about the effects on our environment, and also thinking about, I mean, the pictures that Dean showed too are just like, the amount of trash that we are hauling out of these places is astronomical. It is so much. And I do cleanups mostly in Rock Creek Park. I live in DC. And so that's where most of my cleanups are. And it's so many bags every time we do it. But it's interesting when you watch, again, the bands because we actually log everything. I always have my volunteers actually count what they find. And when you log what you find, and you see a huge drop in the number of plastic bags or in the clamshells after the bans go into effect, then that we know that those kinds of things work.
Yeah, I mean, I just kind of laid out kind of my blueprint. I mean, when Philip and I started working on coal ash in 2015, nobody was talking about coal ash, but we elevated that issue and got a lot of people involved and, won on that issue. And that's kind of how I see this. We're doing these river cleanups, obviously, because they're important and people want to get involved with our organization. They can't all, like, hey, that's great, you guys are suing everybody, all these polluters, right? We want people to get involved, but the cleanups are a great way to then connect them to legislative priorities and things. And then also too, we are trying to slowly work to build coalition around this issue. And it's hard, a lot of groups have different priorities and different issues. Our focus is on water. Some people are focused on climate change. Messaging is hard. This is a hard issue. I'm not going to deny that. At least with coal ash, everybody understood it's dominions, it's toxic, it's dangerous, it's a public health issue. This is a lot more nebulous, and it's coming from a lot of different places, and people don't understand stormwater. They're not understanding where microplastics, like how they cause public health impacts. And so, like Jesse said, just the more that we can get out and engage people around this issue is really important.
Awesome, thanks guys. Okay, next question for Jesse. So would it be possible to calculate estimates of plastic loading into a tributary, based on the sampling you've done at Potomac, I'm thinking loading as total mass or weight of plastic.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, I was gonna wait to talk about this one instead of putting it in the chat, because I think not probably with my data, because I don't have extensive enough data to do it, but I know that there have been some groups that are looking at trying to compile data sources from for a tributary. The Potomac is trickier because you have so many tributaries feeding the Potomac, and then so you could maybe do it in sections or something, but you would also need pretty extensive data. There are some tributaries that you could use as to extrapolate from maybe, but it certainly wouldn't be something that could be applied to every section, right? Like it's not going to be the same everywhere. Depends on land use and so many different so many different issues. But also I don't do modeling, so I would need someone that could actually do the modeling too. So, but it certainly could be done if you had enough data.
Great, thanks. Okay, next question. Isn't it much easier to collect plastic from natural dams that form the tributaries rather than wait until they break down into microplastics? The creeks and streams leading to Potomac are being severely neglected by our local governments. Isn't stormwater management infrastructure the biggest part of the problem?
So, I mean, I like your idea, because those are basically what you're talking about is a trash trap, right? And like if you go to Little Hunting Creek right here in Fairfax County, there is a trash trap. Unfortunately, the county installed it way upstream, so it's barely catching any of the trash as it goes down through all these malls and then through under US 1. There's so much trash that is accumulating, and then it all ends up in the Potomac River. So I'm literally like pounding my head. We actually have this $500,000 trash trap on Little Hunting Creek, and it's literally doing nothing, but they do serve some good beneficial functions. And, you know, they're being used and cleaned out regularly on the Anacostia River. And so that's why we're saying, I think, you know, this is going to require a multi-prong approach. You know, EPR is not going to solve it. Trash traps alone are not going to solve it. There's a lot of different things that we need to do. But again, I'm going to go back to the point where we got to find ways to prevent trash from getting in the water in the first place, you know, and that is it's a huge cost. It's a big maintenance issue. DOT and lawmakers, they don't want to deal with this stuff, basically putting in these gutter guards, what I'm not sure what you call them, but where they actually catch the trash before they enter the waterway. And those are expensive. We were working to bring those to National Harbor actually as a design to show the world it can be done and is being done. There are places in Arizona, California where they're doing it, but it's hard. It's super expensive, and we got to get lawmakers behind this effort if they're going to invest the money and the energy and the staff time to maintain those things, to commit to do it.
Great, thanks. You know, let's just go for a couple more questions, a few more minutes. Should we be taking photos of brands we find and spread it on social media to shame the brands?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a lot of work I've done over 20 years has been shame. You know, I mean, we always don't have good lawyers to sue polluters and stuff. A lot of the work that we've done is, you know, has been, you know, getting stuff in the media and putting pressure. I think it's great, you know, but again, the more that we can focus on a targeted campaign where everybody's rowing the same direction, that's how we're going to make progress. And that's the challenge with this issue, is you have all these local governments that are, and you know, each county has their own landfill issues, and it's really hard to get everybody on the same page. Like, hey, we got a landfill crisis, we have a recycling crisis, we got a plastics issue that we must start addressing. We're just not there yet, but this is, I think, you know, the first steps that we need to take.
Great. Let's do two more questions and then we'll end things there. So I know there's still a few more. Don't volunteer cleanup outings disincentivize the government from cleaning up their act. Isn't it silly to expect ordinary people to help keep the public sewer system cleaned?
Do you want to answer, Jesse?
I think the dialogue after that post was really nice in the chat. So I think the people, there was good chiming in there of, on both sides. And I think that people seeing and taking responsibility for things around them is always good. Having a stake in your environment is a good thing. But yes, it has to come from higher up to actually make a difference and stop the flow. So I liked that whoever posted that, we should do both. We need both.
Yeah, we need both for sure, because we got to get it out of the, but at the same time, I understand what you're saying, because like one of the big issues that we've had over here is this widening of US 1, which US 1 basically all the way from Aquia Creek down near Richmond, all the way up to DC, crosses tons of tributaries that flow directly in the Potomac. And it is a point source for trash and plastics that are going in the Potomac River, Little Hunting Creek being one of them that I talked about. And, when we talked to VDOT about, okay, you're widening this highway, are you doing anything to deal with the trash that's entering all the storm drains and stuff? They said no, but hey, guess what, Riverkeeper? We're going to create pathways so you can get people down and do river cleanups. And I was like, you're missing the point completely. That we're trying to eliminate pollution from going into the waterway, and you're just talking about, hey, no, it's all right. We're thinking about you. We're going to get these like greenways put in so you can get down there and get people to clean all this trash out. So I hear you. There may be some disincentives, at least with some perception of decision makers, that if there's people there that are cleaning up, I guess it's all okay.
All right, awesome. Last question of the night. So do you have any thoughts on waste to energy incineration? Montgomery County does that at the Covent facility at Dickerson. The EJ movement is against them because incineration is a big polluter in EJ communities that are already overly burdened by toxic industries.
Jesse, why don't you go first?
Yeah, whenever you burn plastic, it's a bad idea. There's all sorts of chemicals that are released, including dioxins, and really awful effects on the people that actually breathe in the fumes from it, whether it's workers or the people in the communities around incineration. So I'm with you, Jen, completely.
Yeah. You'll never find Potomac Riverkeeper Network supporting an incinerator. In fact, this is why we had concerns about this chemical conversion. I mean, it's a fancy incinerator as far as I'm concerned, but the challenge is we have existing incinerators, and that's a tougher issue to take on. But the point that Jesse made and I made early on is that with the China no longer taking our recycling, right now 12% of recycling is plastics are being burned. That's only going to increase. So, incineration is not the answer. We need to come up with ways to, reduce the amount of plastics that we're creating. And, something we didn't talk about, but if people join for that, the Story of Plastics webinar we did a while ago, it's just kind of concerning because the oil and gas industry, the plastic bottle, they're moving, trying to get every consumer, not every consumer, but every food manufacturer start changing over to plastic. So like I love mayonnaise. You can no longer get mayonnaise in a Hellmann's mayonnaise in a glass jar. It's plastic now. So while we're trying to deal with this issue and trying to figure out how to address it, the industry is moving on increasing the amount of plastics being produced, which is a huge problem, which means more going into the incinerators. That's just a huge issue that we really, really need to start getting out in front of.
All right, thanks guys. Thanks for a great presentation. Join Potomac Riverkeeper Network if you want to help out with this issue. Donations help make us run. I mean, we're a nonprofit, so obviously individual help is kind of what keeps us going. We have lots of events coming up soon. We have a member meeting. Oh my gosh, my computer is going to die. A member meeting. I'm sorry if I cut out. A member meeting and Riopalooza coming up this weekend. Riopalooza is at Elizabeth Furnace Park in the Valley, and our Upper Potomac member meeting is in Smithsburg, Virginia, in Upper Potomac on Sunday. So join either of those. Dean or Jesse, if you have anything last kind of words, we'll kind of end it there.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, have a great night, everyone. Bye.
Have a good one, y'all.
Thanks,
for
Emily.
joining.
Bye.
Take care. Thanks, Jesse.